And now the news as it might have been if Labour leader John Smith had lived.
Good evening. Taxes for Britain's highest earners are to rise. The Prime Minister, John Smith, told the Commons today that it was fair and just that six-figure earners should pay the new 50p rate with immediate effect.
We've all got an interest, I think, in having good public services, in having a fair society, and having a more decent distribution of income and wealth in the country.
Dissident backbencher Peter Mandelson has launched a new group aimed at persuading the Labour Party to loosen its links with the unions. It'll be called the New Labour Coordinating Committee and is rumoured to be backed by the Home Secretary, Tony Blair. Mr. Smith said he was relaxed about the group and he had no interest in shutting down dissent. Meanwhile, the leader of the opposition, Michael Portillo, has claimed that John Smith's government is controlled by a Scottish mafia. He's accused Mr. Smith and key Scottish ministers of ruling Britain from kitchen tables in Edinburgh's trendy Morningside each weekend. John Smith has ordered work to stop on the half-completed Millennium Dome in East London. Locals have been giving their views about possible future uses.
They should divide it into four, and then in equal sections I'll have a brothel, come out of there, curry house, betting shop and a pub.
It was 5 years ago, believe it or not, that John Smith, the then Labour leader, was killed by a heart attack. Tony Blair took over, New Labour was created, there was an election landslide, our whole political landscape was reshaped. I knew John Smith, not terribly well, just as a politician and a journalist get to know one another, but I'd fallen for his savage sense of humour, for his appetite for life, and above all for his moral seriousness. So when we heard on that awful morning that he'd died, journalists as well as politicians were asking the same sort of what-if questions. The best Prime Minister we never had, said the Daily Mirror. The man who would have led Britain was the headline on my piece in The Independent. And most of the papers were more or less the same. I don't suppose he'd have liked the comparison very much, but it was a little bit like Princess Diana for grown-ups. We felt that a version of our future had been suddenly ripped away. And so 5 years on, when we ask what if John Smith had lived, it's meant partly as a tribute to the man, but also partly as a way of looking sideways at New Labour. And the first question, of course, is would he have won that crucial 1997 election?
There's a small group of rather despicable little creatures who hang around Millbank Tower, who in private will say to you, oh, we could never have won with John Smith, and they're very disparaging about him. None of them ever dare to say it in public.
The Labour Party under John Smith probably would have won in 1997. Why? Principally because the Tories were in such bad shape. John Major was an ineffective leader. The Tory party was deeply divided. This was the age of sleaze. Black Wednesday had simply sent an exocet through the Tories' reputation for competence. If the Labour Party had won under John Smith in 97, the Labour majority would have been a great deal smaller.
Twig, Stephen, Labour Party, 20,000.
I don't believe it's likely that I would have been a Member of Parliament in Enfield Southgate without Tony Blair and New Labour. I think we would have done very well. I think we would have succeeded in winning all sorts of votes that we didn't win before. But I think that New Labour itself and Tony Blair's leadership were crucial in constituencies like mine.
In retrospect, it really is hard to conjure up in one's mind the extent to which Labour has changed since the time of John Smith, and how under John Smith it seemed more pleasant, more attractive, but essentially the same old party. What Tony Blair essentially did, which John Smith I think couldn't have done or wouldn't have done, was make the Labour Party safe for Middle England to vote for.
Tony Blair was a remarkably effective campaigner, and I think he certainly gave an excitement to politics that few of us could engender. Few of us, well, you can say that again. But I think John would have come through remarkably well, and I think he was winning the battle for public trust.
that every pound of these excess profits and every pound of the fat salaries the managers have come from the British people. It's about time they got
Prime Minister John Smith's government would have been very different. If he'd lived, he would have reformed the Labour Party, not transformed it. But if it wasn't to be a new party, could Middle England ever forget the nightmares associated with old Labour? High tax, the winter of discontent, the miners' strikes. Labour had traditionally seen the unions and the party as indivisible, but to become electable, the party had to change. For Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and what we might call the super-modernisers of New Labour, John Smith wasn't moving far enough, fast enough.
I think there was quite a lot of frustration, and I didn't see it myself, but it is said, and I think it's correct, that at one point Tony Blair did sort of bang his head against his desk in frustration at the fact that things weren't moving quickly enough and that the case wasn't being made strongly enough. I'm not sure that he would have been quite as upfront as that when he was talking to Smith himself. I don't think Smith is the kind of person that you rowed with, really. I mean, he was a very formidable character, and you know, his greatest form of division, really, was to say, "Ach." You know, once you'd had an "ach" from him, you didn't really carry on.
In the end, John Smith did put his neck on the line on the issue of who should elect the party leader. The modernisers were united in their desire to get rid of the union bloc vote, but John Smith wanted individual trade unionists to have a voice in the voting college, and Tony Blair and the super-modernisers didn't. The unions were eventually asked to vote in favour of John Smith's version of one member, one vote.
It is not a choice between one member, one vote and a role for the trade unions.
Oh, I think he was very tense. We knew the stakes were enormous for the credibility of John's leadership, which is why he basically put his leadership on the line and was prepared, I think, to resign over that matter if the vote had gone the wrong way. And it's certainly true that as we had arrived at the conference that year, we didn't know what the result would be, which is never comfortable.
There's no doubt this man, our leader, put his head on the block by saying, basically, I fervently believe, because that's what he believes, of a relationship, and a strong one, with the trade unions and the Labour Party. He's put his head there. Now's our time to vote. Give us a bit of trust, and let's have this vote to work.
At the end of the day, my own union was pivotal, and they decided that they would go along with it, although it was very, very reluctantly. Not because they were against change, not really because it was John Smith who was asking us to do it, or that John Prescott did that rousing speech, as you recall, but that we were told that that would be the end of any alterations, if you want, of the constitution of the Labour Party.
And there might have been no more internal changes if John Smith had lived. His arrival at a fundraising dinner for the Labour Party the night before his death was his final public appearance.
Tony Blair spoke today of the Labour Party being reborn.
Under Tony Blair's leadership, change in the Labour Party accelerated dramatically. He began a crusade to woo Middle England. His assault on Clause 4 of the party's constitution, which committed it to socialist nationalisation, would never have happened under John Smith.
This statement is more radical than the original. Why? Because we intend to put it into practice.
The abandoning of Clause 4 obviously changed the party fundamentally as an ideological party. It is not an ideological party now, and that's why you can be a new Labour Party. Abandoning Clause 4 meant that it moved from being a party in favour of nationalisation to a party in favour of privatisation. It moved from a party of the collective to the individual. That's New Labour.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think the country will say thank you too.
I don't think John Smith would have sought to remove or change Clause 4, but it is the case that he was considering, just before he died, taking an initiative which would have happened at the '94 party conference, which would have been to issue a kind of personal statement or leader's position on the fundamental values of the Labour Party. And I think that would have reflected many of the policy and, if you like, moral positions that are incorporated in the change that Tony Blair pushed through.
Good morning and welcome to the launch of our manifesto.
was stupendously successful. But fascination with spin turned out not to be merely a device to get them into power, it's become the style of government.
What do you think of the show so far? No, stand on the doorstep.
I think that for all of the superb communications around Blair and all of his own brilliance at communicating himself, I still think that people look at him and don't quite know what he is and where he's going. And I think that that's okay when things are going well, but eventually it's a real problem and he has to sort it out. He has to get across an identity. He has to define himself very clearly. And I think that the one advantage that John Smith had was that it was very clear who he was, where he came from, what he wanted to do.
John Smith has shrugged off today's front-page attacks on his leadership in the tabloids. He says support from fair and decent-minded people matters more than sniping from The Sun and the Daily Mail.
Now, I kind of suspect that John Smith would not have gone off to Hayman Island in Australia to court Rupert Murdoch, and that therefore he wouldn't have got headlines like these. Indeed, his relationship with the Tory tabloids generally would have been a lot worse. Against that, the whole style would have been different, more collegiate, less self-conscious, less controlled, and certainly an awful lot less trendy.
I think you would have had far less reliance on spin doctors, far less emphasis on glitzy presentation. I certainly can't imagine him having had anything to do with Cool Britannia.
Well, I think he would have been very keen to promote cool Edinburgh, but I think he was very keen on the arts and the media and enthusiastic about promoting the cultural enterprise of the country. So I don't think he would have objected to promoting that. And the influence of his family too, and his daughters, I'm sure, would have carried quite a lot of excitement and glamour, which isn't totally dissimilar from Cool Britannia.
The control freaks and the spin doctors were all would have been shown the door. They were. I mean, the one obvious casualty of John Smith becoming leader of the opposition was Peter Mandelson was banished to outer darkness. I mean, he wouldn't have him around.
Peter Mandelson would at most be a very junior minister. Margaret Beckett would have remained deputy leader, but there would have been few other changes around the cabinet table.
The same personalities who are currently leading the government would be the same personalities now. I mean, perhaps cabinet meetings might go on a bit longer, and there'll be a bit more discussion, a bit more consultation. As one hears, the meetings are quite short. But I think, you know, John's style of more consultative approach would have been encouraged.
Although the style of a John Smith government would have been very different, what about the policies?
Britain's highest earners will have to pay more tax. The government is introducing a new tax ban for people earning more than £100,000 a year. But John Smith has pledged there'll be no change for the vast majority of taxpayers.
The evidence is, I think, pretty strong on tax. John Smith, unlike Tony Blair, would have had a new top rate of income tax for high earners. He believed strongly in redistribution. Taxation for him was an instrument of social justice, not simply a regrettable necessity in paying for government. Nor was he a great believer in taxation by stealth. But I think we have to be a little careful here, because John Smith was a pragmatist, and back in 1992, during the general election campaign, he'd launched a shadow budget, which was highly redistributive. Not surprisingly, he had been rather stung by the reaction, and my guess is that he wouldn't have made the same mistake twice. Here was what he planned to do in 1992.
The top rate of tax of 50%, which I propose to introduce. I mean, no one earning under £40,000 a year will pay the 50%. So, I mean, that's not exactly hitting people on low incomes.
But having looked at John Smith's proposals, there would be three clear consequences. Interest rates would rise.
I think the 1992 shadow budget was a catastrophic mistake. I think he was terribly influenced by his Lanarkshire constituency and the sort of wages there that sounded as though they made people well off. He didn't understand what people were earning in Essex, what C2s were earning in the south of England. I believe that that shadow budget firstly made tax the issue, and secondly showed Labour to be the party of high taxation.
I think John Smith would have acknowledged that he made a mistake in relation to that draft budget. I think he would have acknowledged that he failed to understand what motivates people in the southeast. He was essentially a Scot, and in Scotland the relationship between public services and taxation is one which is much more readily acknowledged and understood. But against that there was his quite open integrity, and I think people would have forgiven that mistake, and he certainly wouldn't have made that mistake twice.
After 1992, we both agreed together, him as leader, myself as Shadow Chancellor, that the old tax policies had to be completely re-examined. We said that we were going to have new policies on both taxation and spending. I was charged by John with developing these new policies, and under Tony Blair's leadership, we saw the results of the work that first John and I, and then Tony and I were doing.
The danger with redistribution by stealth is that you can do it when there's a lot of money because no one's going to complain, but as soon as the money runs out, or you hit a real economic problem, or people wake up to what you're doing, or you run out of ways of doing it by stealth, which you will eventually, suddenly you haven't actually convinced people that you should be doing this. The redistribution that Smith would have put forward would have been argued for and explained.
John Smith promises there'll be no more privatisations under his government. He's rejected a proposal to sell off the air traffic control service.
Talking to John Smith's inner circle, I don't believe for a minute that he'd have renationalised anything. Spending money to repay shareholders would not have seemed a good deal to him compared to spending it on public services. But I also think that he wouldn't have privatised anything either. He'd have balked at that as one step too far.
The government has sounded the death knell for grant-maintained schools and grammar schools. John Smith says he wants all state secondary schools to be fully comprehensive and under local authority control.
John Smith was a schoolmaster's son, almost marinated in the more pro-state atmosphere of Scottish education. He was firmly pro-comprehensive, though he'd not spent a great deal of time in education policy. My guess is that once he discovered the dismal standards of some inner-city schools, particularly in the south, he'd have changed position in office. But if he'd done so, he'd have taken great care to make teachers feel more loved and respected, not something that New Labour has spent a great deal of time on.
Britain's relations with the United States have hit a new low with John Smith's attack on the US trade embargo and its effect on exports of Scottish cashmere and whiskey. Observers say the scene is set for a showdown with Bill Clinton at the Washington summit next week.
Bill Clinton was emphatically not a John Smith kind of guy, and relations with Washington would have been cooler. But John Smith was a deeply committed pro-European, back to the days when it was unfashionable. Does that mean, therefore, that he'd have gone faster on the single currency than Tony Blair? I'm not sure. He was also a very cautious man, sometimes as cautious as the bank manager he was supposed to resemble.
John Smith has talked about his overwhelming sense of relief that the people of Scotland have voted for a Scottish Parliament. He said he's waited for the moment for the last 20 years.
Well, here we're on much firmer ground. Scottish and Welsh devolution is something real and here and now that probably wouldn't have happened had John Smith not been Labour leader. As a minister back in the 70s, he fought the devolution bills through the House of Commons night after night until they were strangled by the referendums that followed, and he often referred to devolution as unfinished business. Edinburgh, John Smith's adoptive home city, has been a sleepy place in the centuries since it lost its last parliament, and John Smith wanted it back very badly indeed.
And I'm looking forward to it as unfinished business. It will be a very proud day for my colleagues and myself when we walk into the new Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh.
Had he lived, I think it would have been easier for him than it has been for Tony Blair. I think Scotland would have had a wave of euphoria about having a sort of thoroughbred Scottish Prime Minister.
I think perhaps John Smith had a very staid image down in the south of England, but maybe appealed to the Scottish people more than Tony Blair would have done.
I
think the big difference with Tony Blair is that he knows how to work publicity.
I saw a good advertising slogan the other day that described New Labour as genetically modified Tories, which I thought caught the mood quite well.
I think maybe if he'd have still been the leader of the Labour Party, probably you would have found that there'd have been a lot less worrying about what other people thought of him. He would just go his own way. And I think he was a really good guy.
Winning Scotland's right to govern its own affairs was for John Smith a filial tribute to his own people, a revenge for the disasters of the late 70s and the political isolation of the Thatcher years, and a curb on London power. But it also meant a single simple thought that perhaps New Labour would do well to recall. By all means, now and always, trust the people. The trust John Smith himself inspired in the people may start to explain the national outpouring of grief in the aftermath of his death.
Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted.
He knew that poverty and inequality killed life chances, that for the too many, failure in our society became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Consistency was at the core of him. The people know they have lost a friend, someone who was on their side. They know it, and they feel it.
Almost everyone who then mattered to Labour was huddled together in shock. And, as it turned out, they were mourning not only a man, a loved, lost leader, but a certain kind of Labour Party. That party is dead. John Smith was the last Labour leader. What, I wonder, would he have made of New Labour?
Whatever he thought of individual policy decisions, and I'm sure he would support almost all of them, I think he would have been pleased that we are both pursuing a modern industrial policy that he spoke about for much of the 80s, and pursuing a policy for fairness in our community.
Presumably, he is looking down upon us, and he looks at this government, and I think his conclusion would be, well, they do not care, but what a lot of fuss.
John Smith's the only party leader I've ever known who, if you said to me, your life is in his hands, I wouldn't have had a sleepless night. You just trusted this man with this incredible strong moral core.
If John Smith had lived, politics would have been more familiar, more of the left-right affair that we were used to in the old days. Would he have gone on to win a second general election, already being prepared by Tony Blair? And then the third? Well, who knows? This is all a lost Britain that none of us will ever live in. In trying to guess about it, we probably reveal more about ourselves than we do about John Smith, who would no doubt have changed in office and been embarrassed by the odd mistake he never lived to make. But I tell you this, though the headlines fade and most political commentary dates very fast, I think we were right about one thing at least 5 years ago. John Smith would have made a damned fine Prime Minister of Britain.